Imagine waking up in a small, damp room lit only by the gray light of dawn. There is no electricity, no plumbing, no mirror on the wall. Outside your wooden door, the smell of smoke, wet hay, and unwashed bodies drifts through the narrow alleys. You are in medieval Europe, and you are already in trouble. Tonight, we'll drift back in time, but not to a place of peace. Rather, to an era both mysterious and brutal, a world where life was shorter, rules were harsher, and survival was never guaranteed. Let your mind relax. Let your thoughts slow down. As the crackling fire comforts you, we'll gently explore what it really meant to live and barely survive in the Middle Ages. But it was close contrary to popular belief. Not everyone lived in poverty or pain in the medieval world. The Middle Ages, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a 1,000-year saga of empires, kingdoms, plagues, and progress. But let's not romanticize it. If you were an average peasant, and most people were, your day began before sunrise. You'd pull on your only set of clothes, likely thick woolen garments stiff with use. There was no underwear as we know it today, and shoes, if you were lucky. You'd eat a meager breakfast of coarse rye bread and maybe some weak ale or thin soup. Water was rarely trusted, and for good reason, wells and rivers often carried disease. Your home had a dirt floor, one room, maybe a fire pit in the center, and, of course, there was no privacy. Your job? Whatever put food in your bowl. Farming the land, thatching roofs, spinning wool, tending animals, and every bit of it back-breaking. Yet, somehow, amid this hard life, people found joy, stories, songs, faith, community. Still, they wouldn't have lasted a day in our world, and most of us wouldn't last an hour in theirs.
Imagine this. You've worked from sunrise to sunset, and now it's time to eat. But what's on the menu? If you're a peasant, pottage, a thick, bland stew made from grains, water, and maybe, just maybe, a turnip or some onions. Meat was a luxury. Fresh fruit, seasonal. And forget sugar, unless you lived near a monastery that imported rare goods. Preservation methods were primitive. Salt, smoking, and drying were the main tools. But food spoilage was common, so was contamination. Parasites in meat, moldy bread, poisonous mushrooms mistaken for edible ones. Meanwhile, nobles feasted often to excess, but even their diets weren't ideal. They lacked knowledge of vitamins and balance. Rich meats, heavy sauces, and spiced wine filled their tables, and their teeth paid the price. Food was not just a means to survive, it was a gamble. Here's a thought to sleep on. If you caught a fever in the 1300s, your best medical option might have been leeches. Yes, literal blood-sucking leeches. Doctors, if you could find one, practiced medicine based on humors, bodily fluids they believed controlled your health. If you were ill, they assumed your humors were imbalanced. The cure? Bleeding, purging, burning herbs, or perhaps prayers and potions. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no antiseptic practices. Broken bone? It might be set or amputated. Childbirth? A perilous ordeal. Infection? Almost certainly fatal. And yet medieval people weren't foolish. They relied on herbal knowledge, midwives, and remedies passed down through generations. In monasteries, monks recorded and preserved medical texts. Islamic scholars, in particular, advanced surgical techniques far beyond what Europe knew. Still, a toothache in the Middle Ages could be a death sentence. And an infected wound, a trip to the grave. Let us pause for a moment. As the fire crackles softly, for in the mid-14th century, a shadow fell across Europe. The Black Death bubonic plague arrived in 1347, carried by ships and spread by fleas on rats. In just a few short years, it killed between 75 to 200 million people, nearly half of Europe's population. Imagine the fear, the bodies piled in carts, the silence in once bustling villages. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs, believing it protected them. Priests, gravediggers. The plague reshaped everything. Economies collapsed, laborers became rare and valuable, and the old feudal order began to crumble. It was a time of terror and strange opportunity. Out of the ashes, a new world began to rise. Forget modern notions of hygiene. Bathing, it varied. In some medieval cities, public bathhouses thrived until the church began frowning upon them for encouraging sinful behavior. But in most places, you'd wash your face, hands, and maybe feet. Full-body baths were rare, especially in winter. Toilets, almost non-existent. A guardrobe in a castle was essentially a hole in the wall. In towns, chamber pots were dumped into the streets. In the countryside, you went behind a tree or used a pit. Fleas and lice were constant companions, so was body odor. But it was normal, because everyone smelled the same. Perfumes and herbs helped. Lavender sachets, rosemary sprigs. But true cleanliness as we know it was centuries away. And dental hygiene. Let's just say, keep your mouth closed in that medieval banquet scene. So, could you survive a single day in the Middle Ages? No phone, no running water, no heat, no safety net. Yet, despite it all, people endured. They loved, they learned, they built cathedrals that reached toward heaven, and forged stories that echo across time. As we continue our journey tonight, let the flicker of the fire and the hush of history soothe your thoughts. Ahead, we'll explore the darker corners of this time, war, superstition, and the surprising roles of women and children in a world ruled by kings and curses. For now, let your breathing slow. Let the past surround you. You are safe, you are warm, and there is so much more to uncover. Close your eyes and imagine standing barefoot on cold stone. The sun has not yet risen. The air smells of smoke, soil, and sweat. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows. Not to greet a peaceful day, but to signal the beginning of labor. Another day in a world where time is told not by watches, but by church bells, and survival depends on how well you obey your station in life. In this section of our story, we'll step deeper into daily medieval life, the toil of laborers, the burden of belief, the dance with danger, and the strange, sacred ways they tried to make sense of a world they could barely control. In the modern world, many of us choose a career. We apply, interview, and if we're fortunate, we climb a ladder. In the Middle Ages, however, your role in life was chosen the moment you were born. If your father was a farmer, you were a farmer. If he was a blacksmith, so were you. Women had even fewer choices. Most were destined for a life of domestic labor, childbearing, or rarely a quiet life in a convent.
There were three broad estates of medieval society. Those who fought, nobles and knights. Those who prayed, clergy. And those who worked, everyone else. If you were part of the third group, your job was simple: survive. Field hands worked sunrise to sundown in all weather. That meant planting, weeding, ploughing, harvesting, by hand, with basic tools and little rest. Blacksmiths worked with fire and steel, baking in the heat, hammering endlessly. Weavers sat for hours, spinning fibers into fabric. Millers ground grain. Cooks tended smoky hearths. Masons carved stone for cathedrals they'd never worship in. Even children worked, gathering firewood, scaring birds from crops, hauling water. There was no retirement. You worked until your body gave out, or until something else got you first. Say you were accused of a crime. Maybe you stole bread, or someone says you did. Today, you'd get a lawyer, a trial, perhaps a jury. In the Middle Ages, you might be subjected to an ordeal. There were three common types. Ordeal by fire. You hold a red-hot iron or walk across burning coals. If your wounds heal cleanly, you are innocent. If they fester, you are guilty. Ordeal by water. You're thrown into a river. If you float, you're considered guilty. Water rejects you. If you sink, you're innocent. Of course, you might drown. Ordeal by combat. You fight your accuser. God, it was believed, would ensure the righteous party wins. These were not superstitions to the people. They were sacred truths, justice meted out by divine will. The church often oversaw such ordeals, reinforcing their legitimacy. By the 13th century, some of these practices faded, replaced by inquisitions and formal courts. But justice remained harsh. Thieves lost hands, traitors were hanged, drawn and quartered. Witches. We'll speak of them soon. In a world with little science and much suffering, people sought explanations and found them in religion and superstition. Most believed the world was a spiritual battlefield. Angels and demons were as real as cows and kings. Disease was punishment for sin. Misfortune was a test from God. A stillbirth might mean a curse. A failed crop. Perhaps a neighbor had summoned dark forces. Charms were worn to ward off evil. Holy relics, teeth of saints, fragments of the cross were treasured and even sold. And then there were the witches. In some parts of Europe, especially toward the end of the medieval era, witchcraft fears surged. Women, especially midwives, herbalists, or those seen as different, could be accused of consorting with the devil. While widespread witch hunts peaked in the early modern era, the seeds were sown in the Middle Ages. Imagine being a healer called to treat a sick child, only to be accused when the child dies. No defense, no mercy, just fire. It was a world both deeply devout and dangerously suspicious. Now, imagine hearing horns on the horizon. A castle stands in the distance. Its walls are tall, cold and scarred from siege. War has come, and it doesn't knock. The Middle Ages were a time of near-constant conflict. Whether it was a local lord's skirmish, a knight's personal feud, or massive crusades launched across continents, war was woven into daily life. If you were a peasant, you might be conscripted, handed a spear and told to march. If you were noble, you might ride into battle in steel armor, heavy as burden, proud as power. Knights were trained from boyhood. At age 7, they became pages. At 14, squires. At 21, they could be knighted, often after proving bravery in battle. But war wasn't glorious. It was brutal. Weapons crushed bone, arrows pierced chainmail, siege weapons hurled fire and stone. Cities were sacked, civilians slaughtered. There were no rules of engagement. Soldiers returned home changed, if they returned at all. For those who stayed behind, war meant higher taxes, empty fields, and the terror of invasion. Yet still, stories of valor, of honor, of chivalry, these gave hope, gave meaning, even if it cost lives. Subtopic 5. The Church, Comfort and Control. No institution shaped medieval life more than the Church. It was the keeper of time, education, law, and hope. Its bells rang out the day's rhythm. Its festivals marked the seasons. Its priests baptized you, married you, heard your confessions, and eventually buried you. For the average person, faith was everything. Church walls were painted with images of heaven and hell, saints and sinners, eternal reward or eternal damnation. Most could not read, so stained glass and statues told the stories. Monks preserved ancient texts, illuminating manuscripts by candlelight. Pilgrimages were made to holy sites, some walking hundreds of miles for a glimpse of a saint's tomb. But the church also wielded enormous power. It could excommunicate kings. It taxed the poor. It hoarded wealth. And in some eras, it punished those who questioned it, with dungeons. Still, for many, it was the only light in the darkness, a source of order, hope, and community. As the fire crackles beside you now, picture the flicker of candles in a cold stone chapel, monks chanting in Latin, a single soul whispering a prayer for rain or peace or the strength to carry on one more day.
And so, as another chapter of the Middle Ages fades into glowing embers, we begin to understand just how difficult, and yet deeply human, this world was. A place where survival depended on faith, muscle, and luck, where superstition and science danced uneasily, where war and worship stood side by side. Could we last a single day in their shoes? Perhaps not. But tonight, within the safety of your bed, warmed by the thought of this distant world, you've already walked further than most ever dared. In the next section of our journey, we'll look deeper into the homes, hearts, and hidden lives of medieval women and children, their laughter, their fears, and their untold roles in shaping history. For now, let the fire lull you deeper into stillness. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the world, past and present, fall away. Section 3. The Hidden Lives of Women and Children in the Middle Ages. Theme: Strength in Silence. Daily Survival from Cradle to Grave. Soft-spoken voiceover script begins. Fire crackling gently. Wind brushes through trees in the distance. Bells toll faintly from a faraway abbey. Tonight, as you drift between thought and rest, we'll turn away from the battlefield and the throne room, and into the quieter spaces of the medieval world. Places not often written about. Lives rarely celebrated in history books. The lives of women and children. Often hidden, often unheard, yet always essential. Beneath the grand arches of cathedrals and the dirt floors of cottages alike, women and children carried the weight of the Middle Ages on their backs. Their stories, tender, tragic, enduring, lie woven into every thread of medieval life. So, close your eyes, feel the warmth of the fire, and let us step softly into a forgotten world. In medieval Europe, a woman's life was largely determined by her father, and then her husband. Her station, her freedom, her labor, all were defined by the men around her. Yet within those confines, women built lives full of resilience. Peasant women. For a peasant woman, daily life was a rotation of unending tasks: drawing water, grinding grain, baking bread, tending animals, spinning wool, weaving fabric, raising children. In the fields, she worked alongside men, planting, harvesting, caring for livestock. There was no such thing as a day off. She might give birth in the morning and return to her chores by afternoon. Midwives, often older women with knowledge passed down over generations, guided births, treated injuries, and acted as community healers. They were essential, and sometimes feared. Noble women, for a noble woman, life seemed easier, but only from afar. A lady of the manor might oversee servants and manage estates, especially if her husband was away at war. She was expected to be pious, obedient, and skilled in household management. In some cases, she wielded real political power, acting as regent, negotiator, or even military leader in her husband's absence. Still, her value was largely tied to her dowry and her womb. Marriage was arranged, often at a very young age, and bearing male heirs was her most important duty. Not all women married. Some, especially those from wealthier families, entered convents. Life as a nun could mean access to education, writing, healing, and prayer. In cloisters, women copied manuscripts, tended gardens, and even advised nobles. Abbesses, the female heads of monasteries, could wield enormous influence, spiritually and economically. But religious life came with its own sacrifices: celibacy, obedience, and a lifetime of seclusion from the outside world. Let's follow the imagined life of a medieval girl. She is born into a small farming village. The midwife washes her in cold water. Her family hopes for a boy. Sons mean strength in the fields, inheritance of land. But she survives, and that alone is cause for celebration. As a toddler, she learns by watching, mimicking her mother's hands, stirring imaginary pots, holding sticks like knitting needles. By age 5, she's helping with real chores, gathering firewood, carrying water, watching younger siblings. She rarely plays, though children did have toys, simple carved dolls, balls made of pig bladder, hoops, and board games like Nine Men's Morris. At around age 12 or 13, her body begins to change. There's no coming-of-age party, no explanation of what's happening to her. Just quiet glances from older women, whispers, a new responsibility. She is now of marrying age. A match is arranged, perhaps to a boy a few villages over, or a widower twice her age. Her feelings don't factor in. She leaves her family, her friends, her home, and begins again, often in silence. Her life becomes her household, her husband, her children. If she is lucky, they are kind. If not, there is little recourse. And so the cycle continues. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was both sacred and terrifying. Childbirth was dangerous. Pain relief was minimal. Sanitation was poor. 1 in 3 women died in labor, and for those who survived, the work had only just begun. A typical woman might bear 5, 7, even 10 children, and still outlive only half of them. Infant mortality was devastatingly high. Illness, malnutrition, infection, all claimed the smallest lives. Mothers swaddled their babies tightly, believing it helped bones grow straight. They nursed them or hired wet nurses if noble. They soothed fevers with herbs, sang lullabies passed down through generations, and prayed endlessly for their children to survive the winter. The grief of a medieval mother was profound, but often silent. There was no counseling, no shared ceremonies of healing, just a quick burial, a return to work, and another child on the way. What did it mean to be a child in medieval times? It meant being small in a big, dangerous world. Children were not coddled. They were expected to obey, to work, and to grow up quickly. There were no schools for peasants. A boy might learn to read if lucky, often taught by a local priest. A girl, rarely. Children played games of tag, dice, stick and ball. They sang songs, told riddles, and carved toys from wood. But they were also expected to help, tend animals, fetch water, gather kindling. At age 7, a boy might become a page in a noble household, learning manners, swordplay, and service. By 14, he was a squire. At 21, if he proved himself, he could be knighted. A girl might be married by 12. There was little concept of adolescence. One day you were a child, the next you were not. And yet joy existed. Siblings played together. Families gathered around fires. Folk songs and stories, often silly, sometimes dark, passed the hours. Life was hard, but never without moments of laughter. Despite the restrictions, some women carved out influence. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun, was a composer, writer, philosopher, and visionary. She corresponded with kings, popes, and emperors. Her music still survives. Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of both France and England, led armies, managed courtly life, and shaped the politics of 2 kingdoms. Christine de Pizan one of the first female professional writers, challenged misogyny and wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in the 15th century. Even in quieter places, women left their mark. Midwives were repositories of wisdom. Herbalists kept knowledge alive. Matriarchs led families through famine and plague. Women in guilds worked alongside men, weaving, brewing, baking, healing. Their names are mostly lost, but their legacy endures. What happened when women stepped outside their roles? A widow, especially one without sons, was vulnerable. She might be forced to remarry, join a convent, or lose her property. And then there were those accused of witchcraft. The line between healer and heretic was thin. An herbal remedy that worked too well, a gaze held too long, a child's fever that wouldn't break. All could be grounds for suspicion. These women, often older, unmarried, or poor, became scapegoats in times of fear. Sometimes they were exiled, sometimes tortured, sometimes burned. Yet others wandered by choice. Women who joined pilgrimage routes, minstrels who sang in taverns, merchants' wives who traveled with goods, cross-dressing rebels who lived as men. They defied the norm and walked dangerous paths, but walk them they did. So now, as the fire crackles low and the night draws close, we reflect on the unseen strength that held the medieval world together. Women who bore life, buried children, healed wounds, and endured. Girls who became wives before they could finish being daughters. Children who laughed, cried, and carried burdens too big for their hands. They did not wear crowns. They did not write the laws. But without them, no lord would have ruled. No cathedral would have stood. No village would have survived. They lived in silence, but their stories echo still. So, rest now in the warmth of their memory. In our next chapter, we'll explore medieval myths and strange beliefs, dragons and demons, relics and riddles, curses and cures. But for now, breathe in, breathe out. You are safe, you are calm, the past is quiet, and the night is long. Tonight, we won't travel by road or by river. Instead, we'll take a different path, the winding corridors of the medieval imagination. Beyond the mud-slick villages, the grimy battlegrounds, and the candlelit cathedrals, there existed a realm just as real to the people of the Middle Ages as stone and steel the realm of story. Myths, legends, curses, miracles. They whispered through every village, flickered in every hearth fire, and shaped the way medieval people saw their world. The boundary between truth and tale was paper thin. So close your eyes, let the fire warm your face, and follow me into the deeper shadows of the past, where dragons flew, demons whispered, and dreams were doorways to the divine. In the medieval world, monsters were not entertainment. They were explanations. Why did the harvest fail? Why did war erupt? Why did good people suffer and die? When reason failed, myth stepped in. Dragons, massive, winged serpents breathing fire, were symbols of chaos, destruction, and sin. They lived in dark caves or guarded ancient hoards, devouring livestock or burning villages. But to the medieval mind, dragons weren't merely beasts. They were metaphors for greed, heresy, or even the devil himself. St. George's legendary battle with a dragon became the ultimate tale of good versus evil, Christian versus pagan, light against shadow. But dragons weren't alone. Demons prowled the edges of medieval life, lurking in illness, whispering temptations, stirring doubt. They were believed to inhabit everything from twisted trees to sudden storms, from nightmares to fevers. And they were cunning. Some were named: Asmodeus, Belial, Beelzebub, drawn from ancient texts and religious warnings. Others were nameless, shapeless, ever-present. Paintings in churches showed them with horns and claws, dragging the damned to hell. They were real, terrifying, and always watching. To a medieval person, resisting temptation wasn't just moral, it was survival. As dark as the world could seem, there were also lights, flickering signs of grace and the divine. Miracles were believed to be everyday events, not magic, but divine intervention. Proof that God, or his saints, still moved among mortals. A blind man might touch a holy relic and see again. A sick child might be healed after their mother whispered a sacred prayer. Such stories spread fast, sometimes through monks who documented them, other times through traveling pilgrims who had seen it with their own eyes. And then there were relics. The finger bone of St. Peter, a thorn from Christ's crown, the blood of a martyr preserved in glass. These relics were said to hold power, to heal, protect, or inspire. Churches competed to house the most sacred objects. The more powerful the relic, the more pilgrims would come. And with them came gifts, donations, prestige. But faith was genuine. People walked for months, barefoot through mud and snow, just to touch a scrap of cloth or kneel before a silver box. In a harsh, uncertain world, these relics were anchors of hope. Magic in the Middle Ages wasn't fantasy. It was woven into daily life. Charms were tied to wrists. Salt was scattered across thresholds. Herbs were hung above cradles, and whispered blessings protected newborns from the evil eye. Most of this was folk magic, a mix of superstition, oral tradition, and local custom. Women especially held this knowledge. Midwives, herbalists, grandmothers. Their remedies often worked, easing pain, lowering fevers, calming fears. But this power came with danger. The Church taught that all power should come from God, and that any unexplained act, any unnatural knowledge, might come from a darker source. Enter the witch. Not the pointy-hatted figure of fairy tales, but often a real woman. Older, single, poor, or simply outspoken. If crops failed, if a baby died, if a cow stopped giving milk. Suspicion grew. Witchcraft trials became more common later in history, but the seeds of that fear were deeply medieval. A cauldron, a black cat, a whispered word, and suddenly you were the enemy. The line between healer and heretic was razor thin, and many walked it unknowingly. To a medieval mind, nothing was random. Everything, every bird call, every change in the wind, every flickering candle, meant something. A comet streaking across the sky foretold disaster. A sudden eclipse might signal a king's death. A fox crossing your path? Bad luck. A double rainbow? A blessing. Astrologers, often monks or scholars, mapped the stars, believing they influenced everything from personality to politics. Kings consulted star charts before going to war. Farmers planted crops by moon phases. Dreams, too, held weight. A dream of water meant purification. A wolf might symbolize betrayal. Falling could mean sin. Rising, redemption. Books were written. Dream manuals, celestial guides, treatises on natural signs. Even weather had meaning. A thunderstorm might reflect divine anger. A sudden warm breeze in winter. A witch's doing. The world was alive with signs. The key was interpretation. To live in the Middle Ages was to live within a grand, symbolic tapestry, where nature, spirit, and story interwove constantly. Not all stories were warnings. Some were windows into wonder. Tales of King Arthur, his sword Excalibur, and the wizard Merlin stirred hearts across Europe. The Knights of the Round Table, with their quests for honor and the Holy Grail, embodied chivalry, a code of courage, loyalty, and love. These stories were not just for nobles. They were told in taverns, at hearths, in markets. Wandering bards and minstrels kept legends alive, singing them, shaping them, sharing them. There was also the Green Man, a figure of nature, often carved into churches. He was wildness and rebirth, mystery and balance. No scripture spoke of him, yet his face peered from stone ceilings across Christendom. In the woods, fairies danced, sometimes helping lost travelers, sometimes stealing them away. In lakes, women rose with swords. In mountains, giants slept. These stories were not believed in the way we believe in facts. They were believed in the way we believe in dreams, deeply, quietly, collectively. They explained what the world refused to say plainly, and they remain with us, echoed in bedtime stories, fantasy novels, and the tales we still whisper to comfort ourselves when the night grows long. So now, as your thoughts soften and your breath slows, remember this: to live in the Middle Ages was to live in a story told through thunder and starlight, through relics and riddles, through monsters and miracles. To the people of that time, the world was not just what it appeared to be. It was layered, holy, haunted, alive, and perhaps in some quiet way they weren't wrong. So drift now, into dreams, into myths, into a place where truth is wrapped in legend, and legend sings softly like the crackling fire beside you. You are safe, you are warm, and the story is far from over. Close your eyes, take a deep breath. Tonight, you awaken in another lifetime, not as a king or knight, but as an ordinary soul trying to survive in the harsh, unpredictable world of the Middle Ages. This is not a tale of castles or conquests. This is a quiet, slower, grittier truth. A day in the life of someone just trying to make it through. Let us step into the worn boots of a medieval peasant. The hour is just before dawn. The rooster crows. There's no clock, no alarm. The rhythm of the land is your only timekeeper. You sleep on a straw-filled sack on the dirt floor. Your home is a single-room cottage, shared with your family, the few belongings you own, and, depending on the season, a couple of animals. The air is musty, damp. Smoke from last night's fire still lingers, stinging your eyes. Before your feet hit the floor, your day has already begun. There's no luxury of morning routines. You're cold, hungry, and behind on work. Always. Your hands are already cracked. Your back already aches. Yet somehow you rise. If you are a man, you head straight to the fields. You till the land not with machines, but with crude tools and an aching spine. You work for a lord, one who may own everything, including you. Much of what you grow, you don't keep. If you are a woman, your world is no less demanding. You fetch water, often a long walk with heavy buckets. You tend the garden, mend clothes, bake bread, care for animals, nurse children, and gather firewood. You may also work in the fields beside your husband. And if you are a child, there is little time for play. You help wherever you're needed, feeding chickens, gathering kindling, watching siblings, or scaring off crows. Formal schooling is rare. Hunger walks beside you, always. Crops can fail. Winters can stretch endlessly. A bad harvest could mean starvation. You live not for dreams, but for survival. Meals are simple: a porridge of grains or pottage, a stew of whatever vegetables or scraps you can find. Bread is coarse, dark, and sometimes mixed with ground peas or beans to make flour stretch further. Meat is rare, a luxury saved for feast days, if ever. You drink ale, even the children. Water is unsafe, often tainted. Ale is weak, barely alcoholic, but boiled and brewed, making it safer than the stream behind your home. Meals are eaten from shared bowls. Hands are wiped on clothes. Utensils are limited. There are no spices, no sugar, no indulgences. Just enough to get you to tomorrow. Life is full of hardship, and so religion is a daily thread. Bells from the church tell time better than any sundial. You attend Mass regularly, confess sins, and observe feast days and fasts. Saints are prayed to for protection, healing, and mercy. There's little separation between the sacred and the secular. Everything has a spiritual consequence. Even storms and plagues are seen as divine punishment. Your suffering isn't meaningless. It's a test, a lesson, or a sentence. You don't question it. You survive by believing. Medicine is primitive. If you fall ill, you may not recover. Doctors are rare and expensive. Most healing comes from local herbalists or midwives. Remedies include leeches, prayers, or mixtures of garlic, honey, and hope. Surgery, when it happens, is brutal. No anesthetics, no hygiene, just pain and prayer. If you survive childhood, and many don't, you still face an average life expectancy of 30 to 40 years. Not from old age, but from accidents, infection, childbirth, and famine. To be alive is a miracle. To grow old is almost saintly. You wear the same clothes for weeks. Made of wool and linen, they're stiff and itchy. You may have 1 or 2 sets at most. Bathing is rare, perhaps a few times a year. Soap is made from animal fat and ash. Public bathhouses exist in some towns but carry risk of disease, gossip, or worse. Lice are common. Teeth rot. Wounds fester. But there's no time to worry. A clean face doesn't put bread on the table. Life isn't all pain. Sometimes there is music, a flute, a fiddle, or a traveling juggler. There are feasts, weddings, and holy days. There's storytelling by the fire, riddles, songs, and dancing. You might attend a fair, see a puppet show, or catch a glimpse of a traveling knight. Children laugh. Old women gossip. Someone brews something stronger than ale. In the cracks of struggle, joy blooms. As the sun sets, darkness reclaims the world. There are no lights, only torches, candles, or fire. Most people go to sleep early. The night is feared. Robbers, wolves, spirits, the devil. Doors are barred. Prayers are whispered. Dreams come, some welcome, some not. And then a new day begins. Castles were not built for luxury. They were born from necessity, power, protection, prestige. A message in stone. Thick walls, towering keeps, moats, drawbridges, arrow slits. Every brick tells a story of siege and survival. They were defensive first, decorative second. But from inside the safety of these ramparts, a very different kind of life unfolds. This is where the lords and ladies dwell, far removed from the back-breaking world of peasants, or so it seems. Because even inside these walls, life is rarely soft. The pressures are different, colder, political, and often perilous. He wakes early, not to plow fields, but to command people. His responsibilities are vast: land, justice, taxation, and warfare. This lord may have been born to rule, or perhaps earned his title through loyalty in war. Either way, his days are filled with decision-making. He meets with stewards and bailiffs to collect taxes, hears petitions from villagers, settles disputes, and hosts visiting nobles who may one day be friend or foe. The castle is not only a home, it is an administrative hub, a courtroom, a fortress, and at times a prison. Despite the silks and furs, the Lord is never at rest. A wrong alliance, a failed harvest, or an insult at court could end in ruin or rebellion. To be a lady of a medieval castle is to live within layers of responsibility, restraint, and ritual. She manages the household, servants, kitchens, stores, linens, and guests. She may not rule with a sword, but her influence is felt everywhere within the stone walls. She oversees the education of her children, especially her daughters. Manners, languages, embroidery, religion. She's expected to be graceful, wise, and above all, loyal. Her marriage was likely arranged, a political alliance sealed before she even reached adulthood. But don't mistake her for delicate. A noblewoman might defend the castle in her husband's absence, negotiate with dangerous men, or protect her children through cunning and courage. Her strength is quiet, but undeniable. To be born into a noble family is to be born into expectation. Boys are taught to ride, hunt, fight, and lead. They learn Latin, history, and scripture, with tutors correcting every flaw. They train for battle from a young age, sometimes sent away to be pages or squires in another household. Girls are taught to sew, sing, dance, and behave. Their value is tied to purity, beauty, and marriage potential. Childhood ends quickly. By 12 or 14, most noble children are betrothed, and by 16, often wed. They carry the weight of generations, titles, alliances, and bloodlines, all before they've learned who they truly are. Behind the elegance of courtly life are hundreds of hands. There are stewards and chamberlains, cooks and grooms, laundresses and scribes. Each plays a role in the castle's daily rhythm. Meals must be prepared for dozens, sometimes hundreds. Beds turned, fires lit, horses fed, walls patrolled. Hierarchy rules everything. The steward is second only to the lord in authority. The butler manages the wine cellar. The chaplain sees to spiritual needs. The constable maintains security. Even servants have ranks and reputations. The lady's maid might know more court secrets than the lord himself. Power flows quietly in whispers and in favors. At the end of the day, the great hall comes alive. Trestle tables groan with meat pies, roasted birds, cheeses, and ale. Minstrels sing songs of valor and love. Jesters provoke laughter and sometimes offense. Tales are told of saints and dragons, of heroes and heartache. Here, nobility celebrates what they've built or distracts from what may be falling apart. There is joy, yes, but it is always performed under the watchful eyes of rivals, alliances, and ambition. In the medieval castle, even merriment is political. Beneath the visible grandeur, quieter dramas unfold. A servant caught spying, a noblewoman exchanging letters, a knight returning from war changed, distant. Alliances crumble behind tapestries. Betrayals bloom in silence. These stone walls remember. They've witnessed secrets that never reach the chronicles. Tonight, you are not here to judge or interfere. You are simply a ghost among memories. Let the wind in the corridor guide you. Let the whispers of velvet and steel lull you towards sleep. We have only scratched the surface. Sleep not just in the safety of warm blankets tonight, but within stone walls, thick and watchful. Beyond the noble courts and velvet-draped chambers lies another heartbeat of the medieval castle, one forged in steel and sharpened by duty. The knight. His role is romanticized by legend and tale, but behind the shining armor is a life of training, sacrifice, and blood. Let us walk with him now, from page to protector, in the chill of dawn before the world wakes. Knighthood was not a simple title. It was a lifetime path. At around age 7, a noble boy would be sent to another lord's castle as a page. There, he learned manners, writing, reading, and the basics of weaponry. By 14, he became a squire, assistant to a full knight. He polished armor, tended horses, cleaned weapons, and watched battles unfold, often too close for comfort. He learned through observation, pain, and repetition. He practiced jousts and swordplay daily. He endured injuries, long marches, and lessons in honor, sometimes harsher than any blade. And when deemed worthy, not just skilled, but honorable, he would kneel before his lord or monarch. Touched by sword on each shoulder, he rose, a knight. Knighthood was not just a badge of war. It came with a code, chivalry, an ideal as heavy as chainmail. Protect the weak, serve your liege, uphold truth, respect women, show mercy, fight with honor. It was a beautiful dream, but reality often blurred those vows. Knights were warriors, and war is not clean. Pillaging, betrayal, and brutal combat tested every oath. Some upheld chivalry to the letter. Others wore it as a mask. Still, the idea of the chivalrous knight endured, a light in the fog of war. It gave the people something to believe in. To defend the kingdom, castles were not built randomly. They were engineered masterpieces of survival. Moats discouraged tunneling and slowed attackers. Drawbridges could be raised in moments. Portcullises, iron gates, slammed down to trap intruders. Murder holes allowed boiling oil or rocks to rain down. Arrow slits gave archers advantage without exposure. Every stairway turned clockwise, giving the right-handed defenders more swing room and attackers less. Watchtowers gave early warnings. Signal fires connected distant forts. Bell towers rang alarms that echoed for miles. Castles were more than walls. They were war machines made of stone. A castle was always ready for war, even in peace. Dozens of soldiers lived within, not glamorous knights, but professional men-at-arms. They slept on wooden bunks, trained daily, and took shifts on the walls. Their diet was plain, their duties long. Rain, snow, or swelter they watched, eyes trained on horizon and tree line. They inspected supplies, sharpened weapons, reinforced barricades. They were the silent shield between the Lord's family and the chaos beyond the gate. Many died unnamed, but none forgotten. When war came, it didn't knock. It rolled up with catapults, ladders, and burning tar. Sieges were brutal, often lasting weeks or months. Enemy armies camped outside the walls, cutting off supplies and hope. The defenders rained arrows and boulders. They poured boiling water, dropped rocks, and launched counter-catapults. Inside the walls, rations were counted. Water conserved. Morale flickered like candlelight. Disease spread. Fear grew. And still they endured. A siege wasn't always about battle. It was a waiting game. Who would break first, the attacker's patience or the defender's stomach? Some sieges ended in brave victory. Others in quiet surrender. Among the most respected and feared minds in wartime was the siege engineer. These were the architects of war. They built machines to tear down what others had spent decades constructing. The trebuchet, a giant throwing arm that hurled stones the size of oxen. The battering ram, reinforced and fireproofed. Siege towers, mobile fortresses that scaled walls. Mining tunnels, dug beneath foundations to collapse entire towers. Their genius was as valuable as any army, and as deadly. Some castles fell with negotiation, others with betrayal, some in fire and fury. When walls were breached, chaos reigned. Civilians ran, nobles fled or hid, soldiers fought room to room. Victory often brought looting and violence, but sometimes, just sometimes, a last stand turned the tide. A rally in the courtyard, a knight refusing to yield, reinforcements appearing over the ridge. History remembers the walls, but legends are built from what happened inside them. And tonight, those legends echo, softly. You don't need to see the flames, just the flicker on the stone. Tonight, our journey leads us through corridors where royalty never lingered, into the living breath of the castle's underbelly, where the real work happened, where servants whispered, fires burned, bread rose, secrets spread. Behind every banquet, every war council, every velvet-draped corridor, there were hands unseen and lives unlived. Let us step now, not into a throne room, but into the heart of motion, into the passages where the medieval castle truly lived. The great feasts of the castle, golden roast fowl, sweetmeats, and loaves by the dozen, were not the work of magic, but of sweat. The kitchens roared from before dawn till long after moonrise. The cooks, mostly men, managed fires, meat, and mealtime politics. Flour dust lingered in the air. Soot clung to ceilings. Spits turned heavy with pork and venison. Barrels of ale and mead lined the walls. Bread was life, baked daily in massive ovens. Porridge and stew fed the common folk. The grand dishes were for the Lord's table, but the rhythm fed all. The kitchen was command without nobility. It was an orchestra of timing. One broken egg or burnt joint could draw a noble's wrath or spark court gossip for weeks. Those who worked here seldom sat, but their presence filled every belly in stone walls. For every visible hallway, a secret one ran beside it. These were the servants' passages, slender tunnels where the unseen moved, the whispers of the castle. Servants were the ghost hands of the keep, rising before dawn, retiring after midnight. Some carried linens, others emptied chamber pots. Some managed the fires, cleaned the stables, or polished arms in the garrison. They were not permitted to speak unless spoken to. They memorized who liked wine warm and which noble feared thunder. They passed on the scandal before the nobles themselves knew it. For every king's word, 100 unseen hands moved to make it real. And in these tunnels, far from light, they breathed a different kind of life. Quiet, tireless, watchful. Beneath the joy of feasts and music lay a place colder than stone. The dungeon. Sometimes a single room, sometimes a warren of cells and chains. Its smell was unforgettable. Mold, rot, and sorrow. Not every prisoner was a criminal. Some were political rivals, accused witches, enemies of the state, or merely someone who said the wrong thing too loudly. Guards did not speak unless necessary. Food was slipped through cracks. Straw served as beds. Torture was rare, but feared. Some dungeons never saw sunlight. Some prisoners never saw freedom. It was said that screams in the lowest cells were swallowed by the earth, and only the walls remembered. Even now, in castle ruins across the world, dungeon walls are cool to the touch, as if holding centuries of breath. There was no hospital as we know it, but the castle infirmary offered healing, of a sort. A wounded knight, a fevered child, a cook burned by the hearth. They were brought here. Herbs were ground, poultices applied, wounds stitched with boar bristles or horsehair. Leeches were common, so was bleeding. Sometimes prayers were all that remained. The healer was not always trained. She might have learned from a mother or a monastic scroll, but she was trusted, and in a world of iron and flame, her touch meant more than most blessings. Medieval life was not clean, but efforts were made, especially in castles. Laundresses scrubbed clothing by river or basin. They used ashes, lye, or fermented urine to bleach and cleanse. They hung linens high on ropes, checked for lice, mended tears. It was harsh work, cold water, cracked hands. Latrines or garderobes jutted from the castle walls. Waste dropped into pits or moats. They were cleaned occasionally, or ignored until they overflowed. Some castles had drainage systems, surprisingly complex. Still, illness spread. Odors lingered. But even among plague and poor hygiene, there was an instinct, perhaps eternal, to tidy, to purify, to reclaim a sense of order. A scrubbed cloak, a cleared hearth, a small defiance against decay. Not all power wore a crown or carried a sword. The steward and chamberlain were the managerial minds behind a castle's function. They tracked grain stores, paid wages, negotiated trade. They ensured harvest taxes were collected, that servants had tasks, and that noble guests were well fed and discreetly monitored. They walked quietly. But even the Lord answered when the steward warned of empty coffers or spoiled harvest. In a way, they were the true governors, invisible to outsiders, indispensable to everyone inside. We've traveled far, through fire-lit kitchens, hidden passageways, and forgotten cells. Now, let us enter the stillness, because even in a world built on war and labor, belief, knowledge, and fear held their place. A castle was not only a place of power, it was a place of prayer, thought, and mystery. Come now into the dim-lit chapels, the echoing libraries, and the superstitions that stitched medieval minds. Every castle had a chapel, though they varied in size and splendor. Some were grand, with soaring vaults and colored light. Others were modest, a single room, a wooden cross, and the scent of frankincense rising. Here, lords prayed for victory. Soldiers prayed for survival. Women prayed for safe childbirth. Servants whispered hopes no one else would hear. Mass was held regularly. A resident priest or chaplain would chant in Latin, the sacred language of the Church, even if few could understand it. Confessions were whispered beneath cloaks, sins named, futures pleaded. Faith gave shape to fear. It gave reason to war, to famine, to death. If the castle stood tall, it was by God's will. If it burned, it was His judgment. The chapel was the soul of the keep, a quiet heartbeat beneath the clang of iron. Books were rare, sacred, labored over by monks, priceless to common folk. But in larger castles, particularly those with learned lords, a library might exist. Not rows of shelves, but perhaps a cabinet, or a scribe's corner with half a dozen volumes. These books spoke of medicine, astronomy, theology. Some were written in Latin, Greek, or Old French. Illuminated manuscripts, pages hand-painted with gold and color, whispered stories of saints, kings, and forgotten lands. A lord might consult a bestiary, filled with beasts real and imagined. A healer might reference an herbarium. A clerk might copy tax records onto parchment by dim light. Ink was precious. Mistakes were scraped off with knives. Knowledge moved slowly, but it moved, and in those pages the medieval world stretched beyond the walls, beyond famine, beyond sword, to thoughts eternal. Sometimes beneath the kitchen or near the infirmary, a small chamber was set aside for herbs and tinctures. This space was part pharmacy, part alchemist's lair, part whispering well of folklore. Mint for fever, sage for the gut, valerian for sleep, but also lavender to ward off spirits, rosemary to purify air, rue to keep witches at bay. Some women, wise women, midwives, or cunning folk, used these herbs both for healing and for protection. In the candlelight, the line between medicine and magic blurred. A dried toad in a jar, a charm carved from bone, a black cat weaving between stone jars. To some, these women were healers. To others, they were dangerous. In later centuries, many would be tried, even burned as witches. But in the castle's shadowed corners, they were both feared and needed. The medieval mind was never far from the unseen. They believed in angels and demons, in saints and spirits, in curses and relics. A storm at sea, God's anger, a stillborn child, a curse, a successful harvest, a saint's blessing. Castle doors were marked with crosses of chalk. Salt was spilled to trap demons. Iron was hung above cradles to keep fairies at bay. Gargoyles, those twisted faces on castle towers, were more than rainspouts. They were guardians. Monsters that scared away worse monsters. Even the architecture bore fear. Arrow slits shaped like crosses, floors salted before weddings, windows aligned with solstices. The line between the sacred and the supernatural was thin, often walked unknowingly. And for every soldier on the battlements, there were two unseen fears being warded below. In every old castle, there are rooms that no one speaks of. A sealed stair, a chamber without a door, a trapdoor hidden beneath rushes. Some were priest holes, hidden spaces to shelter clergy during times of war or persecution. Others were hiding places for treasure, or for people. And some, no one remembers their purpose. Even today, archaeologists stumble upon hollow spaces behind walls, staircases to nowhere, entire levels hidden for centuries. Why were they sealed? Was it plague? A murder? A secret kept too well? In the quiet corners of a castle, history sleeps, but sometimes it stirs. A creak with no footfall, a chill in a warm room, stone remembers. And so we wonder, what stories lie sealed beneath our feet? And so our torch dims in these secret halls. We have walked where few did, not in the courts of lords, but the hands that turned the gears. We have seen the faith that shaped mornings, the books that lit minds, and the myths that wrapped around hearts. The medieval castle was not only a fortress, it was a world entire pulsing with thought, prayer, and superstition. A sanctuary, a prison, a machine, and a dream. Even now, its echoes reach us through crumbled walls and faded tapestries. Even now, we are drawn to its mystery. Let the final ember glow. Let silence fall once more, and let your dreams carry you where only memory and moonlight can follow. They wore silks. They sat on thrones. They were bowed to, obeyed, and feared. But royalty was never a life of ease. The crown was heavy, not in weight, but in worry. Not just in jewels, but in judgment. To be royal in medieval times was to be caught in a cage built from politics, family, and the ever-watchful eyes of history. Tonight, we step into that world, not as peasants looking up, but as kings and queens looking out. From the moment a royal child was born, their life was no longer their own. Before they could walk, they had a title. Before they could speak, they had alliances made in their name. Before they could understand, they were being watched. By nobles, by foreign dignitaries, by the church, by their own family. A prince might be celebrated, but he was also a symbol of succession, of security, of political promise. A princess, equally vital, not for power, but for marriage. She was a living treaty, one day to be married off for land, peace, or loyalty. Their toys were few, their caretakers many, their lessons never ending. Latin, heraldry, swordplay, manners, religious instruction. Even their food was political, tasted for poison, served in precise order, watched by stewards, ars, and when they cried, they were hushed, not with kisses, but with reminders of who they would be. They were not raised to be children. They were raised to be watched. A royal boy might begin training with weapons at age 7. By 12, he would ride with the hunt, sit beside his father in council, and study the art of war, not as a possibility, but a certainty. He was told from the start, "You will rule. You must be ready." And ready meant ruthless. A princess, meanwhile, would be taught grace, piety, and restraint. She would learn to dance, to sing, to read sacred texts, and to smile even when frightened. She would be told, "You are the kingdom's gift. One day you will be given away." And so, even in learning, the royal path was laid. There was no choice, only duty. To be king was to be surrounded, but never truly known. Every word was heard, every glance measured. The court, that swirling body of dukes, counts, ladies, and lords, was a theater. And the king, both lead actor and director. Each noble had ambitions. Each smile could hide a dagger. Even in his bedchamber, the king was not alone. Advisors, guards, attendants. Every movement, from waking to sleeping, was watched. To show weakness was to invite rebellion. To trust too freely was to fall. Even letters were read. Dreams speculated upon. A misplaced phrase could start a war. The crown sparkled, but it bit, and in that glittering isolation, many rulers aged early. Paranoia was not a flaw, it was survival. For the queen, life was no less a performance, but hers was more complex. She was expected to be fertile, gracious, pious, and invisible when inconvenient, yet radiant when required. She was mother to heirs, but also a diplomat. In many cases, she came from foreign lands. A princess sent away from her home to marry a man she'd never met, in a court that might not trust her. Her accent, her customs, her manners, all were scrutinized. Some queens became powerhouses. There are few things more romanticized in history than royal love. Paintings of elegant weddings. Tales of queens waiting in candlelight. Kings falling in love at first glance. But the truth of marriage in medieval royalty was far from love. It was strategy. Calculated, measured, signed in ink and sealed with wax. To marry was to create peace or war. A wedding could redraw maps, seal alliances, or spark bloodshed. Let's step into that world now, where vows were less about devotion and more about diplomacy. Royal marriages were rarely chosen by the bride or groom. Instead, they were arranged by advisors, cardinals, and monarchs seeking advantage. If a kingdom wanted peace with its neighbor, the king might offer his daughter to the enemy's son. If a duke's power was rising, marrying him to a royal cousin could draw him closer, or weaken him. These were not unions of passion. They were chess moves. A princess of England might be sent to Spain. A French noble might wed a Byzantine heir. Distance meant nothing. Only power mattered. And once the marriage was made, it was nearly impossible to break. Because a royal marriage wasn't just about the couple. It was about kingdoms. For the royal bride, marriage often meant goodbye. She would leave her homeland, sometimes forever, to live among strangers, in a language she didn't speak, governed by customs she didn't know. She might be 12 or 13, married to a man twice her age. Often she had never seen him before her wedding day. Her dowry would be immense, gold, land, even ships or armies. But she herself? She was expected to be obedient, graceful, fertile, and quiet. She would live in a foreign court where she might be viewed with suspicion, especially if tensions rose between her birth country and her new home. Every word she spoke, every decision she made, would be reported, interpreted, and judged. She might be lonely, but never alone. Even her servants were chosen by the court. Her crown sparkled, but it did not comfort. Some marriages worked. When two powerful houses united peacefully, the result could be decades of stability, a union between Spain and Portugal, France and Austria, England and Scotland. These marriages could end wars without a single sword drawn. Children from these unions carried the blood of both kingdoms, making them powerful but also vulnerable. Sometimes a child would be sent to the court of their future spouse to be raised there, an early form of diplomacy through shared lives. But even in peace, the pressure never lifted. If the queen failed to produce sons, the peace was threatened. If the king died young, the union unraveled. And if either betrayed the other, through infidelity or alliance with a rival, war could return with fury. Marriage may have stopped bloodshed, but it never guaranteed peace. Love was rare, and risky visual cue. A candlelit chamber where a queen stands at the window, watching her husband ride away to war. True affection was rare in royal marriages, and when it happened, it could be dangerous. A king might fall in love with someone unsuitable, a foreign noble, a maid, a court musician. When Edward VIII of England abdicated the throne in the 20th century to marry Wallis Simpson, it shocked the world, but it was hardly new. Long before that, kings were punished, shamed, even overthrown for marrying outside expectations, and for queens, love outside marriage was unthinkable. Rumors alone could destroy them. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, queens executed for alleged affairs, sometimes true, sometimes fabricated. A royal affair wasn't scandalous. It was treason. In the court, love was dangerous. Often, it was better to feel nothing. Over centuries, royal marriages created an incredibly tangled web of bloodlines. By the 16th century, nearly every European royal was related. Cousins marrying cousins, second cousins marrying uncles, all in an effort to keep the blood pure. But the consequences were dire. Generations of inbreeding led to medical issues, hemophilia in Russian royalty, madness in the Habsburg line. Some monarchs were born sickly. Others struggled to produce heirs. Still, they continued to marry within the same pool, because marrying a commoner was unthinkable. Royal blood was seen as divine, a gift from God not to be diluted. And so the crown sat heavier with each generation, bound not only by politics, but by genetics. In many kingdoms, the royal couple's first night together was a public matter, not in exposure, but in presence. Attendants would accompany them to the marriage bed. Witnesses stood just outside the door. It was symbolic, yes, but also political. The marriage had to be consummated. There had to be proof, because without it, the union might be declared void, and all the peace it promised would collapse. Every pregnancy that followed was tracked. Every miscarriage mourned and whispered about. Some queens faked pregnancies to buy time. Others were accused of adultery when they failed to conceive. To bear a healthy son was to secure a dynasty. To fail was to risk everything. So often, royal couples lived parallel lives. They shared palaces, meals, and ceremonies, but not intimacy. Many slept in separate chambers. Many confided more in their advisors than in each other. and yet they were tied for life, not just by vows, but by history. Some became true companions over time, learning to understand and even love each other. Others lived in quiet resentment until death. A royal marriage was not a love story. It was a kingdom's contract, a living treaty dressed in velvet, sealed with a kiss, but always signed in strategy. To be born into royalty was not simply to inherit wealth and luxury. It was to inherit danger. Enemies were not always across borders. Sometimes they lived inside the very walls of the palace. Sometimes they shared your blood. Because in royal courts, power was never secure. It had to be defended, constantly, and often the true battle was not fought with armies. It was fought with secrets. Every royal court was a stage, grand, golden, magnificent. But behind the throne, behind the feasts, was a world of cunning and fear. Courtiers were not just servants or advisors. They were players in an endless game of survival. Everyone had ambitions. Everyone had enemies. Some plotted to rise, others plotted to remove. Rumors were weapons. A whispered lie could spark investigation. A forged letter could spark treason. Even an innocent gesture, a glance, a misplaced compliment could be twisted into conspiracy. For the crown sat heavy, and there was always someone willing to remove it. Royal blood was sacred, but that created a problem. Too many people shared it. A king might have 5 brothers, dozens of cousins, children from different marriages, and each of them might think, "Why not me?" Some had stronger claims than the monarch. Others believed they'd be better rulers. Some were simply angry at being left out. And so began the plots. Alliances formed in secret. Supporters gathered quietly. And soon rebellion rose, not from peasants, but from within the royal bloodline. Because for every crown, there are many who feel it should be theirs. Betrayal did not always come from distant rivals. Sometimes it was seated right at the royal table. There are countless stories of poisoned feasts, backstabbings, and mysterious illnesses, many never proven, but whispered for centuries. Consider Richard III, accused of murdering his nephews to secure the English throne, or Ivan the Terrible of Russia, who executed his own son in a fit of paranoia. In these courts, even family was suspect. To rule was to trust no one completely. Not your friends, not your siblings, not even your children. History is filled with accounts of royal betrayal. Julius Caesar, stabbed by his senators, including Brutus, his friend, Empress Wu Zetian, who seized power in China by removing rivals within her own family. Elizabeth I, who signed the execution of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, for plotting against her. Sometimes betrayal was driven by ambition, other times by desperation, and sometimes by justice, because not all kings were just. Not all queens were beloved. Some deserved to fall. But in the shadows, morality blurs. A righteous rebellion and a selfish coup can look very much the same. In every court, the most powerful person was not always the one on the throne. It was the one who whispered to them, advisors, ministers, regents, confessors. They were the ones who shaped policy, directed armies, arranged marriages, and sometimes orchestrated betrayals. Thomas Cromwell, Cardinal Richelieu, Rasputin. They rose not by blood, but by brilliance or manipulation. And their fall, when it came, was usually swift and brutal. Because the throne had room for only one crown, and too much influence could be dangerous. To have an heir was to secure the dynasty, but it was also to introduce threat. Heirs could grow impatient. They could be manipulated by rivals. They could lead rebellions, or be used as figureheads by factions. Some kings preemptively imprisoned or even executed their sons to prevent coups. Others were dethroned by their children. One of the saddest examples, Shah Jahan, the emperor of Mughal India who built the Taj Mahal, was later overthrown and imprisoned by his own son, Aurangzeb. Love and fear. Pride and paranoia. They danced constantly in the halls of royal succession. Some threats came not from within, but from bold outsiders. Pretenders claimed royal blood, even when none flowed in their veins. Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, both pretenders to the English crown in the 15th century, convinced thousands of followers of their false identities. Sometimes the people wanted change so badly they didn't care if the claim was real. A good lie, told at the right time, could dethrone a king. And once the battle began, truth rarely mattered. Only victory did. To survive as a ruler in medieval or early modern times required more than strength, more than lineage. It required foresight. It demanded vigilance. Rulers often lived in a constant state of alert, reading between every line in a letter, watching for shifts in loyalty, decoding the subtle changes in court behavior. It was a game of eyes. Who bowed too low? Who avoided your gaze? Who smiled too long? In the subtle language of court politics, these were not trivial gestures. They were signs, and for a monarch, missing a sign could mean losing everything. Espionage wasn't just a tool of war between nations. It was part of everyday royal life. Nobles paid servants to listen in on royal conversations. Courtiers employed informants to monitor each other. And kings and queens, knowing the game, planted their own spies throughout the palace. In Elizabethan England, Sir Francis Walsingham developed an intricate spy network to uncover Catholic plots and protect Queen Elizabeth the Mayor. He intercepted letters, forged documents, and used double agents. One of his greatest triumphs? Uncovering the Babington plot, which led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. In this world, paper could be as deadly as poison. Marriage was rarely about love. It was about leverage. Royal children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, were promised in marriage to secure peace, win allies, or neutralize rivals. These unions could bring kingdoms together, or pull them apart. Sometimes a marriage solidified power. Other times it sparked war. When Louis XVI of France married Marie Antoinette of Austria, it was meant to heal wounds between two empires. But as revolution brewed, her foreign heritage became a symbol of corruption, and ultimately a reason for her execution. To marry in the royal world was to be a chess piece, precious but expendable. Rulers had to wear many faces. To the public, they were divine, chosen by God, untouchable. To foreign leaders, they were strong, wise, capable, threatening if needed. But in truth, many lived in fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of sickness, fear of betrayal from those closest to them. And yet they could never show it. A weak monarch invited chaos. So they wore masks of certainty. They delivered speeches with poise, even as armies marched against them. They attended feasts with a smile, even as their food was tested for poison. To rule was to perform, endlessly. Some rulers maintained power through kindness, others through sheer terror. But cruelty was a dangerous sword, sharp but double-edged. King John of England, reviled for his heavy taxes and ruthless methods, was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a humiliating loss of power. Henry VIII, though mighty, bred fear and paranoia with his numerous executions, including 2 of his own wives. Cruelty bought short-term obedience. But in the long run, It bred resentment. And resentment, in the shadows, always waits to bloom into rebellion. Even absolute power has limits. Despite their power, monarchs were not invincible. They could be overthrown, imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The fate of deposed royals varied. Some were quietly erased from history. Others met grisly ends. Charles of England was executed publicly in 1649 after a long civil war. His trial and beheading shocked Europe. A king tried and punished like a common man. In France, the guillotine claimed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, their deaths ending centuries of Bourbon monarchy. And in Russia, the entire Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife and children, were executed during the Bolshevik Revolution. To fall from a throne was to fall far, and rarely was the landing soft. In the end, most monarchs, no matter how grand, become echoes. Their policies are debated. Their palaces become museums. Their portraits collect dust. But their stories endure. Not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Behind the ceremony, beyond the golden robes and jeweled crowns, there was often silence. No matter how full the throne room was by day, filled with ambassadors, soldiers, and advisers, at night, the monarch often dined alone. Many rulers had no true confidants. Everyone wanted something, a title, a marriage alliance, a war, a pardon. To be a king or queen was to live behind a mask of command, never truly revealing weakness, never fully trusting anyone. In that isolation, some monarchs turned to superstition, or to madness. Take Queen Victoria of England. After her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died, she spent decades in mourning. She dressed in black for the rest of her life. She spoke to Albert's spirit during seances. She ordered his clothes to be laid out daily, as if he would return. This was not simply grief. It was an attempt to fill a silence no adviser could cure. And she was not alone in her rituals. Many monarchs, especially in their final years, turned to mystics, prophets, or signs from the divine, seeking guidance in their solitude. Because when you cannot trust men, you may turn to ghosts. Children raised as weapons. Visual cue: young princes and princesses at sword training, watched by stern tutors. Even family wasn't a sanctuary. Royal children weren't raised for love. They were raised for duty. Often taken from their parents young, they were taught diplomacy, war, languages, and law, not affection. A prince might never see his mother without an appointment. A princess might be betrothed before she could read. When sons became threats to their father's rule, they were exiled. Or worse. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the most powerful rulers of the Ottoman Empire, ordered the execution of his own son, Mustafa, fearing rebellion. The grief tore at him for years. But power demanded sacrifice, even the deepest kind. Some monarchs, isolated from reality, collapsed under the weight of their roles. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, was so consumed by grief after her husband's death that she refused to bury his body, keeping it near her for years. Emperor Nero of Rome grew paranoid, killing even those closest to him. And many others, trapped in palaces but starved of genuine human connection, descended into paranoia, obsession, or delusion. History remembers their madness, but rarely asks what loneliness brought them there. To be royal was to always be watched, every gesture interpreted, every word dissected, every mistake magnified. So monarchs became actors. They learned when to weep, when to smile, when to rage. Their lives were scripted. weddings arranged, tours scheduled, speeches written. Even their deaths were choreographed. Consider the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I. Horses draped in black, 1,000 mourners dressed in solemn garments, the crown placed atop her coffin as if to remind the world, even in death, she was sovereign. But what did she whisper to herself on her final night? Was she proud? Was she afraid? We'll never know. Power gave kings the world, but not peace. Their beds were guarded, yet they tossed and turned. Their riches were vast, yet their hearts were often poor. They were cheered in public, but wept in private. And while the people feared them, they often feared themselves. In their final days, many monarchs expressed the same longing, not for more power, not for more gold, but for simplicity, for freedom, for sleep, to walk freely in the garden, to speak without judgment, to rest without fear. Things they had once denied others, now denied to themselves. Before dawn, the day begins. The bells hadn't yet rung. The sun still hid behind the hills, but the servants were already awake. By the time the lords stirred from their beds, the staff had been working for hours, fetching water, heating coals, preparing bread, scrubbing floors, hauling chamber pots. Most servants woke in shared quarters, damp, cold, and crowded. There were no soft pillows, no privacy. Only the knowledge that failure to rise on time could mean punishment, dismissal, or worse. In castles and manor houses across Europe, servants were the first to rise and the last to rest. History remembers the kings, but it was the servants who made the kingdom run. There was no glamour in this world. To be a servant meant to be unseen. To scrub the stone steps the queen ascended. To stir the stew no noble would question. To change soiled linens, clean chamber pots, sweep ash, and polish armor that you'd never wear. Some were born into service, the children of servants, their futures predetermined. Others had been orphaned or impoverished, sold into servitude by desperate families or captured in war. And still others, especially in great households, served from childhood to old age, loyal, silent, exhausted. Always listening, never heard. Visual cue. A servant eavesdropping behind a curtain, expression unreadable. Servants knew everything. They overheard secrets as they poured wine. They witnessed betrayals in hallways. They saw the real faces of nobles when masks slipped behind closed doors. But they could never speak of it. A careless word could mean punishment. An overheard secret, if repeated, could cost a life. Some servants did rise. Trusted chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting, even royal advisers. But most remained shadows on the wall, always watching, never watched. Their tools weren't swords or scrolls. They wielded brooms, buckets, cloth, and knives not for battle, but for slicing bread, peeling roots, and mending garments. Some were cooks, others stable hands. There were laundresses, midwives, seamstresses, scullery maids, footmen, torch-bearers, kennel-keepers, falconers. Each role was precise. Each person replaceable. In some homes, even smiling at a noble could be punished. In others, servants were treated with a measure of care rewarded with food, shelter, and safety in exchange for unwavering service. But kindness was never guaranteed, and dignity was rarely offered. At night, after the torches were extinguished and the feasting halls emptied, the servants slipped into sleep on rough bedding. Sometimes they whispered to each other, about dreams, about pain, about the small hopes that tomorrow might be easier. They laughed quietly when they could. They cried alone. and if they were lucky, they might live long enough to become head servants, no longer scrubbing floors, but commanding those who did. Still, their names faded from the records. No statues were built in their honor, no songs sung, but without them, no throne would have stood. Born to the soil, imagine, a life where your fate is set from the moment you're born. Not by prophecy, not by dreams, but by dirt under your fingernails. This was the reality for the medieval peasant. From the Scottish Highlands to the sun-baked fields of southern France, the peasant's world was one of toil and repetition. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from their village. Their days were governed by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of the landowner to whom they owed their labor. There was no glory in the fields, just survival, and that was hard enough. Peasants rose before the sun. They worked until the last glimmer of daylight vanished beyond the treetops. They didn't work by the hour, they worked by the task. Plowing, sowing, reaping, hauling stones, digging ditches, herding animals. Women gathered berries, spun wool, baked bread in clay ovens. Children carried water, scared away crows, and learned to mimic their parents' labor before they could read. If they ever learned to read at all. Peasant life was harsh, but it was also rhythmic. The fields breathed with the seasons, and the people followed suit. The land did not belong to the peasants. They worked it, lived on it, and died upon it, but it was owned by the lords. In exchange for a thatched roof and a few strips of land, peasants paid rent in grain, eggs, livestock, or labor, and beyond their lords they owed the church. Tithes, a tenth of everything, were demanded, even in famine. If the harvest failed, starvation loomed. But the taxes never stopped. A poor harvest meant going hungry, not just for one season, but for a whole year. Though life was hard, the peasant village was not joyless. Festivals tied to the agricultural calendar brought moments of relief. Spring meant May Day with ribbons and dances. Harvest festivals in autumn celebrated survival and bounty. Weddings, births, and saints' days added music and storytelling to otherwise labor-filled lives. Superstitions and oral traditions shaped daily routines, warding off evil spirits, planting by the moon, thanking unseen forest guardians. To survive the grind, peasants leaned on each other. They shared tools, bread, and burdens. They lived tightly, simply, and often wisely. Faith in the fields. Visual cue, a small stone chapel, candlelight flickering, peasants kneeling. Religion was not a choice. It was the air they breathed. Every peasant knew the rhythms of the church bell. Mass on holy days, confession, baptisms, funerals. The village priest was one of the few educated people they'd meet. To peasants, heaven was real and terrifying. They believed in sin, damnation, and the hope of salvation. Suffering on earth was seen as a test or punishment, or even a blessing in disguise. To toil humbly, to suffer quietly, that was the peasant's spiritual calling. And for many, faith was all they had. The average peasant rarely lived past their early 40s. If that disease, poor nutrition, accidents, or childbirth often claimed lives early. Medical care was primitive. A wound could mean death. A cold could turn into fever, and fever into silence. Entire villages vanished during the Black Death. Children were lost frequently. Still, life went on. Graves were dug. New children were born, and the plow was never idle for long. At night, peasants gathered around smoky hearths. They ate thin stews, drank weak ale, and spoke in hushed tones. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they told stories, of strange lights in the woods, of saints and spirits, of heroes they'd never meet. They knew nothing of politics and little of kings, but they knew love. They knew hardship. They knew how to coax life from stubborn soil. And when they finally rested, they dreamed beneath the same stars as those who ruled them. Stars that did not care about rank or coin. Just light, just distance, just time. The edge of society, imagine being born with no last name, no land, no protection. Now imagine waking up one day with spots on your skin, a rash that won't fade, or a deformity others fear. Not because it's dangerous, but because they believe it marks you as cursed. In the medieval world, there were those who did not fit, and the world made sure they knew it. They were beggars, lepers, the exiled, the insane, the condemned. They lived on the outskirts of villages, and civilization out of sight, out of reach, and often out of hope. Leprosy. It was the most feared disease in medieval Europe. And yet, it wasn't just the disease that terrified people. It was what it represented: suffering, decay, God's punishment. Lepers were legally required to live apart. They were made to wear bells to announce their presence and walk with sticks to avoid touching anyone. Monasteries and some charitable institutions offered isolated leper hospitals, leprosaria. But more often, lepers were left to fend for themselves. Sometimes they were stoned or driven out by force. To be a leper was not just to be sick, it was to be unwanted. Mental illness was not understood. There were no diagnoses, no therapies, only labels: mad, possessed, or cursed. Those who exhibited unusual behavior were feared, mocked, or even imprisoned. Some were thought to be witches. Others were sent to convents or locked in cellars. The Bedlam institutions of later centuries would become notorious for their cruelty. At night, these exiles may have looked to the same stars as kings and knights, but they did so from the shadows. They were not celebrated in song or story. No epic poem tells of the beggar's journey or the madwoman's visions. But they lived, they breathed, they felt love, loss, fear, and hope, just like the rest of us. And in the silence of the medieval night, their prayers rose like smoke to the same heavens, asking for warmth, for mercy, for remembrance. Bound by birth, bought by coin in the grandeur of medieval castles and bustling manors, a silent class kept the world turning. They lit the fires, carried the water, swept the floors, obeyed every command often without thanks. These were the servants, and worse still, the slaves. Not all servitude was the same. Some were born into it, others fell into it through debt, misfortune, or conquest. But regardless of the path, once inside, the way out was nearly impossible. Servants were not simply helpers. They were the hands and feet of the medieval household. Kitchen maids rose before dawn, stoking fires and preparing food they'd never eat. Stable boys tended horses in the cold. Chambermaids cleaned up messes and secrets. Butlers, stewards, and footmen answered bells, curtsied, and never spoke unless spoken to. For many, life was a cycle of commands. Yes, my lord. At once, my lady. Forgive me. Even small mistakes, spilling wine, arriving late, speaking out of turn could bring harsh punishment. A beating, a dismissal, or worse, banishment with no references. To lose a post was to lose survival. Some became servants not through birth, but debt. Indentured servitude was a grim bargain, a promise to work for years in exchange for food, shelter, and the hope of future freedom. Often it was the only escape from starvation. But terms could be extended unjustly, an unpaid fine here, a fabricated mistake there. Children could be born into the same contracts. One generation's desperation became the next's captivity, and the line between servant and slave blurred. Not all servants wore rags. Some dressed in fine clothes, but their lives were no less owned. Squires, pages, and personal attendants to knights and lords were often noble-born themselves, but they lived under strict discipline. They cleaned weapons, saddled horses, and stood by during battle, always ready to die for the one they served. Their path might lead to knighthood, if they survived, and if their masters deemed them worthy. Loyalty was everything, disobedience was ruin. Though often hidden in the folds of Christian virtue, slavery did exist in medieval Europe. Especially in the early and high Middle Ages, people captured in wars, especially from non-Christian lands, were sold into bondage. Muslims enslaved Christians. Christians enslaved Muslims. Vikings captured both. In cities like Venice, slaves were auctioned like livestock. They worked in homes, on ships, and in fields. Some became concubines. Others were brutally overworked and discarded. Church teachings opposed enslaving fellow Christians, but that rule was flexible. Converts were sometimes still kept as slaves. Money and power often silenced conscience. Living without voice. What unites servants and slaves was silence. They were expected to be invisible, to move without complaint, to suppress joy, sorrow, and fear. They witnessed private affairs of nobles and dared not speak. They heard secrets that could change the fate of families and swallowed them whole. Even their loves were limited. A servant might be forbidden to marry or forced to leave their post if they did. To be human was a risk. To be invisible was safety. As the manor grew quiet and nobles retired, the servants remained, cleaning, folding, preparing for tomorrow. In the flickering glow of the fire, they may have allowed themselves a moment of thought, a memory of home, a whisper of a song, a dream of freedom, but only for a moment, because dawn would come, and with it, the bell, the call, the command, and the silence would resume once more. And now, we reach the end of our journey through time. You've traveled far, not in miles, but in centuries, through candle-lit corridors, echoing abbeys, muddy roads, forgotten halls, and ancient forests. You've walked beside kings and peasants, knights and kitchen maids, monks and mercenaries. You've seen the lavish banquets of royalty and the hollow eyes of the starving. You've felt the pull of war, the silence of servitude, and the burden of surviving in a world ruled by others. And in all of it, there has been one constant, the resilience of the human spirit. History isn't always heroic. It isn't always glorious or triumphant. Much of it, in fact, is hard, brutal, often quiet, and almost always forgotten. But tonight, we remembered it. Together. In the flickering glow of our imaginary hearth, we gave voice to those who had none. To the servant who rose before dawn and never saw the sunrise. To the peasant who bent his back to the soil and dreamed of a better harvest that never came. To the child sent away to learn a trade, never to return home. To the scribe who documented a plague and died by its hand. To the unnamed woman whose labor built a home she would never own. To the fallen knight left where he lay beneath the turning sky. To the outlaw, the healer, the widow, the thief, the slave. Each of them a thread in the fabric of the past. Each of them a flicker of life in the vastness of time. And as your thoughts begin to drift, as your breath slows and your body eases deeper into rest, remember this. History is not a place we leave behind. It is the bedrock beneath our feet. It is the distant echo in our choices, our fears, our hopes. Even in the quiet moments, the hush before sleep, the lull of memory, the comfort of firelight. The past is there, watching, waiting, whispering, not to haunt you, but to remind you. You are part of a great and endless story. Perhaps you now see the medieval world not just as a list of battles and kings, but as a place full of ordinary people, just like you, trying to survive, trying to find love, trying to sleep at night with less worry in their hearts than they carried all day. And just like them, your story matters. Your quiet moments matter. Your rest matters. So now, let go. Let go of the noise, the weight of today, the list of things left undone. Let the fire crackle, let the shadows stretch, let your breath grow soft and slow. You've earned this peace, you've traveled far, and now it's time to return, not to the chaos of the modern world, but to stillness. In this moment, nothing is asked of you. No walls need building, no kings need pleasing, no land needs plowing, no letters need writing. Only this, to lie still, to listen, to rest, and if your eyes remain closed long enough, perhaps the next story will come to you in your dreams. A story not written in any book, but waiting in the silence. You may not remember it come morning, but that's all right. History forgets many things, but sleep remembers what the soul needs. So, from the crackling fire to your quiet room, from a forgotten century to the heartbeat of now. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and when you wake, may you carry the calm with you, like the faintest scent of smoke clinging to the air after the fire is gone. Good night, dear traveler, and thank you for remembering with me.